What I'd like to just speak to is what we're going to cover today is the subject, and it's about Me Too, but mostly about how to be a good boss in this environment of Me Too, and how can we, as leaders, both male and female, support principally female staff, not exclusively, but principally female staff who have faced throughout history, likely, as long as there's been bosses and people and predators, that there's been a problem in the workplace. So there's no two ways about that. And some of my friends, both male and female, get a little irritated with me because I take a pretty hard stand on it. In fact, I was out yesterday with some people, and you know what? As far as I'm concerned, the pendulum needs to swing, and it'll swing too far. If a few guys get crushed along the way by the pendulum going too far until it finds its equilibrium, its middle ground, I think it's fine. It's perfectly suitable. But how do we step up to this? And then part of the subject that we're going to talk about a little bit today will be about leadership skills, organizational culture skills, and changes that we need to make as bosses and as leaders. And we will touch on not explicit sexual issues, but we will talk about harassment and talk about issues that may or may not be a trigger to some people. So, and we'll just get underway. So these faces are all pretty familiar. On the left is Kevin Spacey, Louis C.K., Harvey Weinstein, and on the right is Patrick Brown, who was the leader of the Conservatives in Ontario up until a couple of weeks ago when some stories came out. But the thing that amazes me is not that these people, not necessarily that they were predators and they did awful things to human beings. The thing that really amazes me is where was everybody else? Where was the boards of directors? Where were the other bosses? Why didn't people stop this, say something until it becomes public? And even in the case of some of the political characters here, even in Alberta, where people have ran into this and their names have come out, it's painfully obvious that the leaders of these organizations knew something wrong was happening within their system. So why didn't they do something? And I'm completely dumbfounded by people abdicating their moral and legal responsibility to allow these predators to exist. In fact, a lot of people actually fed these people their victims, served them up basically on a platter, and that's quite unconscionable on any number of ways. But now that it's starting to come forward, why are the executive offices quiet? Why did these people aren't these people talking, telling what's going on, or being silent as bosses? Sorry about that. So a little backstory, I wrote a white paper in the fall on the subject of harassment and organizational culture. And the academics and the research is quite clear, is that most people don't report or talk about harassment within the workplace, male or female. Of course, again, as I said earlier, the predominant group of people that are impacted by this are female. But the victims don't trust the system, whether that's the company or the organization, to trust. They don't trust it to look after them and protect them. And the biggest part of this is that the victims of these awful acts and other workplace bullying and harassment and sexual harassment is that they know that the chain of command has never been held accountable and responsible for what's happened. And I had a conversation with a senior person on a police force. It happens to be quite close to where I live right now. The city police force has had a lot of bad press. They've been in the news a lot about female police officers being harassed sexually and bullied and tortured basically at work for all sorts of reasons. And one of the senior leaders asked me what I thought. He said, we were cracking down on the perpetrators. And my response to him was, well, when you start firing staff sergeants and inspectors and deputy chiefs because they covered up for these assholes, then you will actually change the culture. Until you do that, you will never change the culture and never move on. And that's why people don't trust. They go to HR we'll talk about this as the morning goes on a little bit, but they go to HR with the complaint or whatever complaint processes within their organization, and it goes into an abyss where it's absolutely silent. No feedback, no conversation. They never know whether it was dealt with seriously, dismissed, and often, more times than not, the victim of bringing these forward in a culture where it's unhealthy and unsafe for them end up being re-victimized by being transferred, fired, contracts not renewed, or whatever it is. And so we create this environment where a predator actually, his reward, as I said earlier, is most always a he. His reward is actually to get transferred and maybe into a better job or a more cushy goal with more victims. And the military in particular, the prevalence of harassment, although not zero, sadly, within tight formed organizational units of people that work together all the time is actually quite low. Where it goes up high is in a system where in organizations like recruit schools or other kind of loosely formed organizations, and predators can exist in that environment and take advantage of people who are out of their normal safety environments or new to the military or the police, as the case may be. And the predator gets to victimize a whole new crowd of victims every 3 or 4 months. And they're less supervised. So it becomes a real problem. They're actually rewarded for their actions. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes about why I think that's the case. So as I said earlier, supervisors who turn a blind eye to harassment should pay, in my humble opinion, should pay a higher price than the predator. Yes, the predator should come down like a ton of bricks on the predator, but until organizations deal at least as severely, and my humble opinion, at least twice as severely, with the supervisors who fail to deal with this and allow a Harvey Weinstein to get away with it. I understand the power dynamics. It takes bravery and courage, and we'll talk about that. But until the system takes control of this issue, it will exist because nobody is really paying the price. So my example, it's a little bit, I don't know why I'm skipping to here. My example that I spoke about in the white paper in the fall, and I'll provide a link later if you're interested, is not necessarily sexual harassment, but it's a Canadian Airborne Regiment in Somalia. And the gentleman, it's a bit furry just to protect face, blurry and furry there to protect faces. But the gentleman you see in the front is actually a guy I know, Tony Seward. He was a major, he was a company commander. And when he was in this particular unit was deployed to Somalia in the late 80s. It was a problematic organization, to say the least. And it was put in a problematic situation. And there was a lot of things happening on the ground there. And Tony, there was a lot of thievery, a lot of looting from the local Somali people, from the Canadians. And the reason they were looting is they had nothing. It was in the middle of, it was chaos in the country and there was no food and resources and they were stealing to survive. And Tony went on leave from his deployment, and his last sort of instruction was, I don't care what we have to do here, we have to stop these people from stealing. And he left. And what happened next was, if anybody of a certain generation might recall, was 2 Canadian soldiers, a sergeant and a corporal, captured a Somali, he was 16 or 17 years old, captured him stealing within the wire, within their compound, and they took him to a bunker and they tortured and beat him until he was dead. Now that's a heinous crime. There's no two ways about it. And I'm certainly not excusing any of it. But the real sin that happened in that camp that day was the fact that the place was full of sergeants and warrant officers and sergeants majors and captains and lieutenants, and everybody, nobody stopped them. Nobody stopped what happened in that bunker. They didn't stop the torture. They could hear what was happening in there. I hope in your whole lives you never hear what that kind of activity sounds like. Everybody knew, a lot of people knew in fact, in the commission that followed, the investigation that followed, some people said, I heard it, and I even said to somebody, what the hell are those guys doing in that bunker? Nobody went to check. And then this next level of sin was, because people were trying to protect the organization, they covered it up. And at the end of the day, the reason I mentioned Tony, who is, like say, the company commander there, at the end of the day, Tony was only one of the corporal and the sergeant were found guilty and went to jail. The sergeant actually tried to hang himself and almost killed himself. That's another story. Tony and a captain were the only two people in that camp that said, I was responsible for my soldiers, and I accept that responsibility. And Tony wasn't even in country when that happened. He wasn't even on the base, but he issued the order, so he accepted the responsibility for the order. The captain was demoted and didn't last too much longer in the military. And Tony, a 23-year proud, but actually a great guy, to be honest. I knew him well, so I'm a little bit biased. A great guy, accepted that responsibility as their leader, and he ended up spending 90 days in jail and got drummed out of the army and lost his pension. Whether that's a fair punishment or not, maybe, but nobody else paid the crime. All of the other leaders in that camp did not suffer requisite or fair punishment for being a leader and ignoring the problem. And I fundamentally believe that in this environment of Me Too and harassment and bullying in the workplace, that if leaders are not held to that high standard, then we won't get past this. It's great that people are able to tell their story, but you even hear, like from the White House with this, what's his name? I can't recall his name off the top of my head. This secretary to the president who was not found guilty of beating his two wives, but beat his two wives regardless of what kind of guilt or legal system implicated him on that. And everybody stands around and says, he was a great guy. And he did great for our organization, and we like him. And like I say, until we get to the point where we can say that guy might have been a good soldier, might have been a good principal secretary, might have been a good cop, but he was a bastard, and we got to fire him. And until the chiefs of staff and their leaders take responsibility for those people, we're not going to be able to move past this. So you may hear in my voice, I'm actually quite passionate about this particular subject because it flows through your whole organization. If people don't feel safe in your organization, they're not going to work for you. And if you excuse bad behavior because they're a good guy or a good girl or whatever the case may be, nobody else will feel safe and people won't work for you and you won't be successful. So as a leader, we do have a responsibility to make sure people are safe. And I don't believe for a moment that most leaders are fully aware of their responsibility as a boss to make sure people are held safe. So we'll explore this a little bit later. I would encourage, there's lots of people online now. Thanks very much. We waited a few minutes for people to join us and then we started. If there's any questions or thoughts that you have as we're going, please feel free to type them into the chat box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And I'll try to answer them as we go. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to if you want to, we'll unmute people. And if you want to ask questions live and in person over the airways, we'll set that up too. So in this current, even if a boss is a good guy in this current environment, often they don't even know what to say. Like particularly, it's a legitimate statement. Most men are arseholes when it comes to trying to provide comfort at the best of times. We don't necessarily know always what to say. And if you're a boss, you're generally not dealing with people that are in a traumatic or at a tough situation, regardless of family death or a personal crisis outside of work. Most bosses don't engage as human beings when it comes to that as about her. So imagine if you're the boss and people are talking about harassment. And again, principally a male boss in particular, and you got females that are talking about that. Most men are scared stupid of this subject because they have no idea what to say. And they're afraid, well, as we go along, there's other things that they're afraid of, but they're afraid of hijacking it. They're afraid to get beat up, which I think is most of the women in my life are smart and intelligent and thoughtful people and are willing to coach you along, especially my wife, because I do need coaching from time to time. But the first part is they're not good at this. They're not good at being highly intellectually, emotionally intelligent around the subject of talking to people when things are bad. They're good at issuing instructions, but they're not as good at engaging. So when something really bad happens, whether it be Me Too or a death or something else, people are generally very poor at that. Sadly, people that served in the military or in disaster responses and the like, that work with that, people all the time like that generally have a little more experience, but your average Walmart manager, not so much. So, sorry, I'm just going to read this note. Oh, good point, Sandy. Yeah, I don't know if people can see Sandy's comment. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a fear on the victim's side too, Sandy. I agree with you. So Sandy says that if somebody's in a situation, and generally women are disadvantaged economically, it's a fact of life. Also, they have family, especially a single mom or something like that. So they're going to be as scared of to raise up, and that's the culture that of the organization that we have to build that allows people to feel safe to be able to come forward. Oh, sorry, yeah, Sandy just said she just texted it to me, but I did respond to that. So as we go along, and again, bosses in particular, generally male, are very nervous about weighing into this. Any social issue, they're nervous about weighing in. They don't want to cause a problem within the organization. They don't want to feel like they're hijacking the conversation or being insensitive. So a lot of men in particular, but a lot of bosses feel that saying nothing is better than saying something wrong. I don't buy that philosophy, but that's where they're coming from with it. And it's easy to be critical of right-wing wingnuts who are talking about slavery and racism or running out of town all of the LGBTQ people in the town, getting rid of them. But all men are not innocent, period. I've been quite clear that as a human being, as a young guy, when I was dating, of course I was a young arsehole. I drank and I partied and I took advantage of situations, and I know that for a fact that I did not always treat the ladies in my life with the utmost respect. So how can I take a moral high ground stand on a situation like this? Well, the first thing is be honest about it. Be honest about it and start moving forward. And men, lots of men, I hope, like I mentioned earlier in a different format in one of the blogs, I hope and hope and hope that I'm not guilty of this, but maybe I am. But you don't want to bring it up because somebody might bring it up and turn it back on you that you are whoever, it could be me, that is a predator. Even sending out of these blog posts was actually quite nerve-wracking for me because it was like jeepers creepers. Like, I know I'm not innocent, but that's why they don't want to step forward. And I think if you're honest and humble about it, then I think you can get past that. As we mentioned earlier in the story about the airborne regiment in Somalia, the people wanted to protect the regiment. And as we all know, it's a sad, like the history, throughout history, the Catholic Church, residential schools, Red Cross, even Oxfam, just the head of Oxfam just got fired for his people in Haiti hiring and taking advantage of women there as prostitutes and sexually harassing people. But we want to protect the organization because we have this false sense of that it's holier than thou, and if we allow it to be dented and tarnished, that especially in the not-for-profit world, nobody will give us money, or people won't hire us because our our firm has a bad reputation. But what credibility do we have as a leader if we're not being honest about it? I know that there were incidents. There was an incident with Red Cross that involved human trafficking and laborers and workers within the tsunami rebuilding reconstruction project in Indonesia. There was, to be honest, within the organization, a faction that wanted just to keep it all quiet. We put steps in place to protect people and do a better job. Generally speaking, the people that were doing this and were guilty of the actual crimes were the subcontractors and general contractors, but we were the owner. We were the people responsible, so we tried our best to fix it. But what we did do, instead of just kind of covering it up, we actually got ahead of it a little bit, and I phoned all of my key stakeholders before it became public that this had gone on. And the comment that that rings so clearly in my mind was a minister of the Crown here in Alberta, and he said, "I'm surprised that's all that's gone wrong there. It's a very challenging place, but thank you for the call and don't worry about it." So, like, we could have covered it up, but then the sin becomes a cover-up. And then the sin becomes a series of interwoven lies that discredit you and the organization and all of the goodwill you're trying to protect. And in the long run, in the case of the Airborne Regiment, a few years later, something else happened. And the Airborne Regiment was disbanded, which was the only time outside of the winding down of a wartime that a Canadian Army unit was disbanded, and it was because of that. So how do we gain credibility as leaders? How do we become that person? Well, as we talked a little earlier, that there's a number of things, but talking about just your personal credibility, be humble and honest about it. But the number one thing is to talk to your staff and your team and tie Me Too and harassment and a safe work environment back to your business. All of these things have a huge cost. There's studies that show that on average, it takes 5 incidences for someone to quit their job. So somebody within your organization, if they leave their job because of bullying or harassment, has been, I'll use the word tortured, which is fundamentally, I think, is the right word to use, by some arsehole at least 5 times. That's the average. So some people quit the first time and some people quit on the 20th time. Imagine the workplace environment that's in your office or in your team or in your company or in your not-for-profit or school or government organization where people know that this is happening. And whenever I've fired somebody in past for being an arsehole and a harasser and a bad person, the only comment I get back from the employees is, wow, the only thing they were surprised about, and they comment back on it, is that somebody actually did something about it. They knew. Leaders often don't know, but once we find out, you have to deal with it. But people aren't performing when they're unsafe. They're not performing when they're being tortured. And we need, as leaders, to be able to take responsibility for that. And it does have an impact on your profit line or your net or whatever it might be. And there's also huge legal risks of financial penalties and all of the other stuff that come along with it. So as a boss, as a leader, it's our job to protect our people and our organization by being honest and getting ahead of issues like this. I am a firm believer of the most senior person in the organization should be carrying the flag on issues like this and be the person out in front. And it should be selecting a platform that has the most relevance to address the issue. So if I was still in my role with Red Cross, provincial director, I had about 120 people working for me. At a very minimum, I would have addressed this with a video conference and had everybody close by to me in one room that I could speak to. And as the senior person responsible for all these human beings, I would deliver the message, and I would make myself fully available. And then at best, I would try to get around to see people. And at worst, the minimum would be to phone them individually or have group phone calls. If you have to start up a training program or a conversation differently with your employees, it's important that the most senior person available attends every session and sits here. Like, I'm going to have to tell you something, folks, that when we implemented a code of conduct, I sat through, I don't know how many. I bet you I sat through 14 code of conduct training sessions when it was first implemented. Not because I needed to be reminded 14 times, but if I wasn't in the room, I wanted everyone to know that this was important. And I needed them to understand that if I was in the room, then it was important. And stay off your phone and pay attention. And even if it's the 14th time, feign interest and be excited about it, because your lack of energy and your boredom or whatever it might be, or lack of interest, will spread through the organization, and people will automatically go, not important to Armstrong. So obviously it's just a bullshit thing we got to run through here because someone told us we have to do it. So if you're out there delivering this message, it's important that the most senior person does it and that uses the most appropriate platform to get it done, ideally in person. So how do we implement these things? And we have to have it actionable. Yeah, that's a great comment. There's a comment about what if the perpetrator is the most senior person? I think as we talk through this, we might be able to address that, is about how do we action that if the senior people are the perpetrators. So one of the things, and if I don't address it, please call me back to it. One of the things as we deliver these plans and how we build safe environments and address harassment, bullying, and the whole Me Too issue is that the steps have to be actionable. And on this particular subject, and to half address what the comment is about the senior person, is that you cannot have a system that looks rigged. We had a system in Red Cross, it was kind of sad but funny, that it was a whistleblower program, and I tested it one time, and the CFO picked up the phone when I dialed the number. I just about crapped my pants, because that really wasn't a whistleblower program, obviously. But we have to have steps that people can make it easy to report, and make it easy to be not to just be a bystander, but to say, hey, that's not cool, whatever it is, even if it's an inappropriate joke. We need to understand that if somebody says, hey, that joke was off base, it's inappropriate, and everybody needs to be trust that is going to get dealt with. Your core values and culture need to be front of mind. And if you are the boss, you need to be out there all the time talking to your people so that you can act with integrity and be authentic. And there should not be any space. There should be true congruency between your conduct and action and how you conduct yourself within the organization. So if I'm preaching, I'll use the word preaching, if I'm preaching to the team about Me Too and behaving properly and not inappropriately, and the next thing I walk by the receptionist and I say, holy shit, you look great today. So what message did I just send? Most organizations are filled with well-meaning people who are not strong enough to stand up to a senior person who is the abuser. And I think at that point, if the most senior, you get a couple of choices as a person, is to go through the systems that exist. And I think at a certain point, and I know it's hard, certainly for most ladies, female staff, especially with kids, single moms and that kind of stuff, is you have to protect yourself. So lawyer up and get out of there and get good advice or phone the police. But you have to protect yourself. And it's you may not be able to change the culture of the organization. If you're the employee and the most senior people are the harassers, you may not be able to change that culture. And it's not fair, and it's not even right, but you have to get out of there and protect yourself. So we talked earlier about being vulnerable and honest, and you know, even just you know, if I was in a position where I was briefing employees about this situation, I would be quite frank about at least reference the fact that I'm a human being and I've made mistakes, and some of them I'm not very proud of, and the like, and that actually allows people to be more honest and open about it, and to trust that you can do it. And if somebody's going to stand up there and say they've never done it, they've never considered it, they've never thought of it, they're a liar. So as organizations and companies, how can we respond? Well, as we've talked quite a bit about, acknowledge that you're not immune to it. And it's the first step. Acknowledge that it happens. Lots of organizations have fair equity and pay equity and all that kind of stuff in place. But there's still a culture that weighs down on the most vulnerable people within the company, and generally they are new Canadians in general, and females, and people who would be vulnerable anywhere else. So, if as an organization, if you're not taking those steps, encourage people to be honest and have these conversations at work, and and start talking about it. And again, I go back to what I mentioned earlier. The most senior person should be talking about it the most. And if there is a predator you find out in your organization, crush it. Crush it, crush it, crush it. And then find the person's boss and find out why that person didn't know about it. And then crush them. Like, honest to goodness, I cannot repeat enough that leadership throughout the organization is fully responsible for this, not the victim. That's why we call them a victim. And take a stand. I guess I already took a stand. Sorry, a little blood pressure went up there a little bit. We know that this is happening, and we are all responsible. Some people, yes, maybe they should take responsibility for protecting themselves and putting themselves in a safe environment. But at the end of the day, it's the predator and the senior leadership that need to be responsible for what's happening in the organization. So be vocal and be strong about it. On the other hand, of crushing managers, which isn't always the best management process in the whole, hard on morale. But hopefully before you get to the place where you have to crush people, you're able to support the managers. Like, what support systems are you, wraparound systems and education are you providing your managers about how to deal with stuff like this? And how are you working with them to be able to allow them to support their teams? Do they know what resources? I was shocked one day at a senior leadership meeting that somebody was there briefing the team, and people didn't even know that our employee assistance program had mental health counseling available. And it was a relatively senior manager, coordinator manager, who was not even familiar with that. And are your managers creating a culture where people feel safe enough to report concerns? And it goes back to an earlier comment. And the only way you can know this is by getting off. If you're if you're above a group of managers and they have teams underneath of them, the only way you're going to know that there's a connection between you and those people below, the workers underneath those managers, is to get off your butt, get out of your office, walk out into the workplace, into the work zone, wherever it is, the factory floor, get out there and talk to your employees in a way that's not demeaning to managers, but you can find out a lot of information in an hell of a hurry by just asking open-ended questions. People will just start telling you stuff that they trust. Or the other thing that I used to always do was, especially when things were tough, I would bring people together at lunchtimes and coffee breaks. And you learn more about what's going on in people's lives at lunchtime and coffee breaks in a trusting environment than you'll probably ever care to know. So equip your managers, support your managers with the resources they need, and then validate that they are actually doing their job as leaders and supporting their employees underneath them. The paper, I'll send a link out later with the information, a couple links from here, but there was in that How to Stop Culture of Harassment Dead in Its Tracks white paper, there's lots of good advice in that you can read, and there's references. There's all sorts of tools online that you can start with. But just by putting a policy in place or putting a procedure in place and then wiping your hands and saying you did a good job, it's not satisfactory. And most policies like that, in my opinion, are prohibitive. You shall not do this, you shall not do that. But what we have to do is put a system in place that allows people to know what to do then if they see something. And if you've got a team of 100 or so, or 50 to 100 people, and you're not hearing about a problem every once in a while, the problem is that they're not trusting the system and bringing it forward. Get good training, get the best you can implement. There's two things around this. One is everybody knows. It's actually a risk management issue for your organization, but also people understand that you care and that you're implementing procedures. And it should be reviewed. I think one of the things that I implemented last time I had a team was that every time we did annual performance reviews, we reviewed the code of conduct. It wasn't a mandatory thing within the organization, but it was a good thing to do, because most of us, when we start with an organization and we get the code of conduct and we're told to go in the room and read it, well, at that same time, it's probably our first or second or first week on the job, and somebody's given us the IT policy and the harassment policy and the driving policy and sign these TD forms and all this stuff, and we're completely overwhelmed. And I would hazard a guess that 10% of the information in those original packages that you get people to sign when you start up are forgotten or not remembered within a week of that happening. So go back and review. Figure out a way that's safe and comfortable and respectful, that you can have calm, relaxed conversations about this. And this may be when you want to bring somebody in that's good at this work, that can facilitate conversations. You don't want to necessarily make it mandatory, but if people aren't showing up, then that indicates another problem. So as a leader, and let's go back to what I said earlier, I think as leaders, we should attend most of these things ourselves. And I often remember it was me that did it, and it wasn't harassment. I can't even remember what it was. And I was grumbling, and my boss in the Army, who was Major Jerry Overworth, a great guy, and I said, Jesus, Major, I don't want to go to that stupid briefing. I'm busy. I got stuff to do. And Jerry looked at me and he goes, Sergeant Major, please don't tell me that your time is any more valuable than mine, and I have time to go to the briefing. That shut me up in a hell of a hurry. But he made the point that we needed to be at that meeting, and if he could do it, everybody else could. I fundamentally believe, as I've said 1,000 times, that we're all complicit in this. Certainly not all to blame, but the culture that we set up within our organizations allow harassment to go by. And the organizations like the military, police, and even how the comments you're hearing out of the White House right now about this other guy, this wife beater guy, we make excuses because they're a good guy or a good girl, and they do good work, and we need them. And what happens outside of here is none of my business. Bullshit. It is your business, because it impacts everybody within your organization. And if you excuse that, then you are complicit. If you see somebody being harassed or mistreated and you don't raise it as an issue, it takes courage, I understand, and it takes a lot of safe environments around. But if you're not raising that as a concern or helping the person, the Whisper network is a legitimate process, a system, but it's not. It shouldn't have to rely on the most vulnerable people within your organization whispering to each other to protect them from a predator. And if you have an organization that is that screwed up, maybe it's time you should get out of there. But I do understand that's a privileged opinion that, you know, it's easy to go. Start the conversation. So if you have a team right now, even a volunteer team, a mixed volunteer staff team or a full paid staff team, start the conversation that you're actually thinking about it and that you're working on something. Because one of the things that happens as institutions is we start working on this big idea, oh, we should do something around Me Too, and we put a plan together, and we think of all of the things that we need to get done, and we got HR, and we bring in some subject matter experts to help us out, but we forgot to tell people we're doing something. We completely, utterly forget that key part. And if we're not telling our employees that we are concerned about this and are worried about this and are thinking about this and we're going to have an action, then they think we don't give a shit and we're not doing anything, and we lose credibility. So I would suggest that someone within the leader of your organization should be sending out an email or a communication piece to everybody within the company saying, hey, Me Too, we get it, we understand, we're working on this, and this is, you'll see a launch from us. It almost goes to the conversation we had a little earlier about people that even raise a complaint. It gets turned into this machine and it gets moving forward, but they never hear back whether anybody's listening or cares or if anything is ever going to get done. I will send a link to this email. It's a draft. You're welcome to change any part of it out with the recording notes afterwards. And and I might actually, what I might do is just cut and paste it right into that email. It's also in, I believe, the Sunday's post about being a decent human being around Me Too. So I'm going to unmute, and what I'd like to hear from people is any questions or comments. I'm not asking anybody to reveal anything, but I'm going to unmute if somebody wants to jump in with a conversation, or you can use the text box to address this. I would also encourage people to take a look at on Sunday's blog post on my website at stephenarmstrong.ca, because at the end I do talk about just personal guidance for mostly men about how to deal with ladies in the workforce, and there's a bit more information there. I think I unmuted you. Oh, there's something. Yeah. Oh, exactly. So I don't. So everyone should be able to see that. Nancy's point that as a large employer has implemented code of conduct training, which is important. The codes of conduct are good, but yeah, they need another level in there. And I would probably, I don't know who the organization is, doesn't matter. Well, I shouldn't say that, but it's not important. Is that, are they developing another level of code of conduct for bosses? Like, that would be my question to them. Holy cow, I hear somebody typing like the wind. Yeah, I would ask them the question. Does anybody have anything? You're just so you know, you are unmuted. So if you've got a dog barking or something else in the background, but if you can talk or you want to ask a verbal question, that's cool too. If you do, just type it into the text box, and I'm going to do the next slide here. So my question is to anybody, any employee or any boss, we are all leaders in this, and how are we going to do this? So if you have a particular question or comment, I will send out a link to, I'll just come back to your question in a sec. I'll send out a link later in the show notes with the recording, a link that if you want to book a 15-minute conversation, no problem, just reach out. If there's something I can help you with, happy to. If you have a team and you'd like something similar to this webinar presented to your team, I'd be happy to do a free one. And of course, if you want it in person and on site, then we can have a conversation about that. I'm just going to take a look at that note. How do you propose that we address the issue of women being seen as sensitive? I think, yeah, I get it. So men go, wow, you know, there's hysteria, you know, we can't trust women to vote because they're going to be hysterical and make bad decisions. I think you need familiarity and another level of training within your organization. And if I said it once too many times, I'm sorry. It has to come from the top. The CEO or the president or the senior person on site needs to set the standard. And it's things like, so in that last blog post, I referenced this a couple times. It's things like, if somebody is, like in the Army, if somebody is a wimp, they're a Nancy, or they're a, you know, whatever. They use female terms, usually sexualized terms, to diminish or beat somebody up. But what you do, you just don't impact the person that you're talking to. You are diminishing ladies, females, period. So stop using that kind of language. Like, it's just, you just need to change. And I grew up in the 60s. I was a kid in the 60s, and I just told the story, and somebody was shocked, horrified, that in my little village in southern Ontario, at the grocery store, at the little corner store, they had little licorice, but it was the N-word. They were N-word babies, right on the sign. But we've moved past that. It might have been okay then, and it's the same thing with women. Like in the Army at one time, it was not okay to have women in the Army because a woman couldn't carry anything and she might get muddy and cry. And I've seen grown men cry in the Army for a lot less reasons than I ever saw a lady cry in the Army. So we need to set the example and treat people fairly and equitably. And have the conversation. But really, it's got to start from the top. So Sandy, companies need to understand that because many corporations relate profits to being a good Me Too program code can lead to good corporate citizens. Exactly. No, it is. If you have a healthy, safe environment that's people feel protected and safe within to do their jobs, they will work really hard for you. Like my greatest impact, I think, in the world so far, the things I'm most proud of, is that I created systems and teams where people felt safe to be themselves and do good work. I got more done in disasters and all that kind of stuff than anybody else because I built powerful teams built on safe, and we were 100% clear on our mission. It did not just deter us from hitting our targets and being successful, but allowed us to do it with respect. If you lose an employee, you know, even a short-term employee, but say you had an employee for a year or two, and you lose them because of a harassment issue, at a very minimum, they say it costs at least twice a year's salary to replace the person, replace the corporate knowledge, get the person up to speed till they get performing. It's super, super expensive. And that goes back to one of the other comments where it said, tie your case back to your business. So in closing, I'll just pop back up a slide. Feel free to reach out. You just reach out to me on email or by phone. I do answer phone, so it works pretty good, the phone still. And I'm happy to have a 10, 15, 20-minute conversation with anybody about anything you've heard here today, or if you want to give me a hard time about something, that's cool too. I got thick skin. I'm happy to deliver this or modify this for your needs, this webinar for your own teams or an organization you think that would find it of value, that I feel that strongly about it. I'm happy to donate that time. And I'm also willing to come in and we can have a conversation about what that might look like, to be able to provide an on-site workshop or coaching to your leadership teams. I just got involved with another leadership team just yesterday, and it's all about how do those senior managers conduct themselves and do their job in a way that allows the corporation to hit their profit margins, but still create a safe environment. And then in closing of the official part of the webinar is like, we need to act with knowledge and skill. We understand what we have to do here. And we need to be courageous, but yet at the same time, humble and selfless. And we need to do our job with purpose and motivation. Nobody was a hard driver than I was when I was in the Army, but I could still look after people and we can still hit our targets. So you can be purposeful and motivated to get your work done and still look after people. So that's, in closing, that's what I got for you today. If somebody has any more comments, I'm happy to see what we can do, but I know that we're coming up to 11 o'clock and we've committed to an hour. If somebody has something they want to say or add to the conversation, feel free. And again, I'm open at any time to have a conversation, personally or privately. Jumping off. No problem, Nancy, it's my pleasure. Please do reach out if there's something I can help you with. My pleasure. If you want to take care, give Hartley hell for me, will you? Take care, Allison. Thank you. Alexa, always a pleasure. Alexa, you make me happy every time I see your name. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Just you and me, Sandy. Thanks for joining. I hope you found it useful. Okay, Sandy, I'm going to disconnect. We'll chat later. Hopefully we get to see you in person soon. Take care.